few years ago, there was a grassroots campaign going on in the city of Washington, D.C., centered on the issue of service workers and tipping. While this may seem like an innocuous battleground centered on a relatively niche labor issue, it turned out to be anything but, and the schemes and duplicity that came out from the whole affair are emblematic of politics in D.C. There's something of an understanding about politics among residents of the District of Columbia. It's not, don't talk about them in polite company, as it may be in other places in the country, so much as don't bother. This learned apathy is the product of a history of disenfranchisement. So let's talk about that history. DC is a city of contradictions. The first that comes to mind is that DC is a place where politicians come to do politics, but it acts as a bit of an eye of the storm with respect to having political power. Even something so baseline for an American city like having a mayor is not guaranteed. After the 20th elected mayor nearly bankrupted the city, not through nepotism and incompetence as the trend of the times was, but through funding schools and libraries for the free black population, DC lost the privilege of a mayor for 100 years. The 21st mayor's term was cut short, and rule by appointed governors became the norm. And yes, governors is the right word, but it's less like a state's mini-president and more like the governor-general of a territory. The district, as a city, has had neighborhoods in my lifetime with murder rates, unaddressed poverty, and HIV that were the highest in the nation. And those neighborhoods are about 2 blocks away from the Capitol building and the hill it graces. Now, as for why the population of the capital of the free world is so drastically underserved, well, for much of its modern history, particularly following the 60s, the city has been majority black. Before that, it's what I'll call disproportionately black, despite being the capital of a majority white nation and a place where figures of unreachable white wealth and power congregate. But how did we get into that setup? Here's where we have to talk about what being the district even means. The original idea was more like a national park where states would let their elected representatives off their leashes to do their business, but in practice that isn't how it turned out. I kid here, but this contradiction, a city that isn't, is supported in both the Residence Act of 1790 and the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1801 before emancipation, and then after with the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871. We'll get to the relevance of emancipation soon. For now, let's read a sliver of the Residence Act. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled that a district of territory not exceeding 10 miles square. So there you go. They use the word district right from the start. What they meant by 10 miles square was that it was 10 square miles on each edge, leading to 100 square miles in total. But eagle-eyed viewers, those who can even see DC on a given map of the United States, will recognize that it is not, in fact, the shape of 10 square miles because it looks like someone took a bite out of a kite. That bite is from Virginia rescinding their commitment of land following the destruction of the city in the War of 1812. It also had to do with a degree of politics involving Virginia's bitterness over Richmond not becoming the capital, and the pettiness goes so far that they literally donate their share of the Potomac River to Maryland so Maryland can give it to DC. Ultimately, there were difficulties rebuilding after the war, and Virginia did not want to take part. While I joked it was petty, those Virginians may have been right to drop out, given that those living in the district do not enjoy the basic American right to representation in government. As the territory of the district was laid out, those living there, meaning white colonists of Virginia and Maryland, were stripped of their right to vote, not even having a vote in presidential elections until 1961 thanks to the 23rd Amendment. I wish I could tell you that the amendment fixed other issues of representation, but no such luck. The reason for said disenfranchisement was something I'll charitably call idealistic. The thought was that putting DC, or I guess the hypothetical capital, within a state would give that state undue power over the others. Bear in mind that at this time, the division between states was stronger. The idea of a federal government was a bit closer to how the EU sees itself presently, and as such, distinct representation alongside balance of power was very important to the founders. To continue the EU metaphor, think about how France clings to its Strasbourg EU institution because of the power it confers. That's what American founders wanted to avoid. So DC is, as a space, laid out and invented, an extension of small settlement in the area, but by design, not part of any given state. Hey wait, let's step back a tiny bit and talk about the War of 1812. In 1812, trying to pull a sneak attack on Britain while they, and the rest of Europe, were dealing with Napoleon, the United States attempts to invade Canada. It doesn't go well. Turns out the game plan of giving militia boys from all the way down in Georgia a map, a gun, and the instructions attack Ottawa would not be a winning strategy. Those who were inclined with the Federalist Party and against the war would go on to call it Mr. Madison's War. But it's almost always okay to blame Thomas Jefferson for pretty much anything in early American history. You're probably right. His particular hand in this was both pushing Madison, his protege, to start the war, and in having both laid the framework against a trained standing army and in favor of farmer militias, as well as having neglected the Navy in his term. The US was banking on Britain's divided attention, again, because of the whole Napoleon thing. For some perspective on how willing to divide their attention Britain was, there were more British ships in Baltimore's harbor than there were ships in the entire American fleet. Though, perhaps given the aforementioned neglect by TJ, that isn't saying much. Side note, Americans tend to think they won the war or forced a draw. The Wikipedia talk page is full of discussion on who won the war, and the results are a bit complicated in that they don't just show up on a map, but America more or less got kicked in the dick by Canada and the British Navy. Like, inarguably, they burnt the Capitol down, including the White House and Capitol. Second side note, there's also more history on the role of enslaved and liberated peoples within the war, but that deserves its own video if I ever get to it. The significance of the war largely begins and ends with the fact that DC gets torched. Following the destruction, there are debates about packing up Congress and moving the capital to somewhere else, like Philadelphia. Before the war, there wasn't much incentive for any given senator or representative to develop DC. By design, none of them represented the city, and in turn, had no constituency within the city to which they were beholden. Earmark that idea. After the war and destruction, landowners in the area came forward with proposals for reconstruction and development, in a plea to keep DC the capital and, in turn, a district. This meant some manner of development would be coming to the city, but there would remain an absence of representation. The forethought with DC's emerging circumstances was that it wouldn't need to be much of a city, that there would be a place of meeting and some federal businesses. The basic conceit was to avoid giving any state a home advantage by putting federal enterprises there and just shoving them into one neutral space. But this is where the district transcends whatever a district was supposed to be and becomes a city. See, congressmen have families and slaves, and those families and slaves need things like amenities and services and a food supply. So grocers start to exist, and those grocers need tailors and so on, and I don't know how they couldn't see this coming. It's not like they were going to teach slaves the trades of artisans and allow them to leave the district to bring in food on their own. Consequent to the fact that the capital remained DC, which was in the South, slavery was a fact of life there. Virginia was, at the time, reliant on slave labor. Maryland, though it would go on to join the North in the Civil War, was a slave state. DC's own slave population was actually emancipated before the war ended, before the Emancipation Proclamation, via the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act signed by President Abraham Lincoln on April 16, 1862. That's why April 16th is a holiday in DC. The point of all this is that DC not only has a historically black population, but a free black one. And that gives us a clear window into why the city has an underserved and underrepresented population. Okay, and what does all this have to do with a referendum on tipping in restaurants, bars, and nail salons? We'll be there soon, but the documents establishing DC, the history of its black population, and the War of 1812 and subsequent urban development are foundational to understanding why DC is the only place where something like this could happen so brazenly. Earlier I said to earmark the fact that DC doesn't have representation. This is where it comes into play. DC has a representative, but they're not exactly empowered. Consequently, congresspeople from outside DC more or less get to decide the fate of the city in meetings that DC itself barely gets a voice in. That might sound egregious, and like something a modern democracy would step in to correct as soon as possible, but there's some loophole-adjacent issues creating a deadlock, maintaining the non-state nature of the district. The trick comes down to budget autonomy. Now, the reason I call this a trick is that my introduction to it was as such. DC used to have a locally approved, funded, and popularly supported needle exchange program, effective and necessary during a then still growing HIV epidemic. Legislators from outside the district stopped the program through an indirect attack by denying federal funding. The law around needle exchanges at the time, as drug paraphernalia, was that it would be up to the local level, local funding, a state's discretion. Mostly, this setup existed so people wouldn't get mad their tax dollars were funding junkies, not that this system stopped that claim from happening. Now, this is where the trick part kicks in. The district isn't a state, nor is it in one. That means it's got a federal budget like all states do, and on the state quote-unquote level, another federal budget. In effect, there was no local discretion or funding because the money is all federal. Local funding goes into the federal coffers, and DC has to ask for it back to fund things. The Congressional Budget Office and Office of Management and Budget can effectively hold any program in DC hostage whenever they want because of this. That's the magic, and despite some recent legislative changes, there seem to be fun loopholes everywhere. For one, needle exchanges themselves didn't stop being threatened due to a federal law change, because there are 1,001 ways to attack funding channels. Take it like the inverse of pork or a rider bill in Congress where something gets tacked on. Some congressperson wags their finger and gently suggests that the funding the city is reliant on might change if a program that isn't to their liking continues. Legislators from places with conservative constituencies who wouldn't dare attempt to defund such a program back home where it would damage their reputation or re-election chances acted against DC because they can. Now, you might say, good, I don't want DC using my tax money to fund programs that I don't agree with, which is sometimes the argument made by lawmakers themselves, but remember, DC has local funding and tends to be a revenue generator for the government. It's their money. They just have to ask for it. Congress is holding the purse. Hell, this limbo of being federal on a federal level and federal on a state redistrict level is why the drug laws here confuse people and require nonsense workarounds. And that's how we get to the drama of what more or less reads at best as just a plain-faced failure of democracy and at worst comes off almost conspiratorial. Initiative 77. Okay, now you have all the pieces. DC has a mayor, DC kind of controls the budget, DC is not afforded the rights of any of the 50 states, and DC is subject to immense meddling. Oh wait, you may be missing one last thing that's fairly crucial. Jobs that rely on tipping most always had a minimum wage below $4. This might come as a surprise to some people if they've never worked in the service industry, but in a vast majority of the US states, employers and businesses that have tips, ranging from bars and restaurants to some valet services and nail salons, are not required to pay the normal minimum wage. Note that some places with tips, such as places where barista is a title, are often an exception to this. The tips are actually bonus instead of the primary source of income. In the service industry, we are, in essence, living the micro version of DC. We have no control over if we have money, even if we're working in functional. Someone from outside gets to decide, in every transaction, if we've earned it. The consequences of this range from the predictable, like poverty, to the indirect, like routine sexual harassment, which we'll come back to. Controversial opinion, this is bad. The law, in this structure, shows a substantial bias towards business owners over employees. Compounding this with the employment of disenfranchised immigrant laborers and the fact that they are usually not desirable jobs people seek so much as jobs people can get sometimes means that the $3-ish, which is largely intended to cover taxes, does not even get paid. Some states have laws where if in a shift or a work week you have a day where you make less than the normal minimum wage would guarantee you for your time, the business has to pay the difference. In practice, this is routinely ignored and impossible to police without an open payroll system, equally neglected among small businesses and corporate tier food service, for different reasons that are beyond the scope of the video here. I have quite literally worked jobs where the business did not pay me 1 cent. All of my pay came from tips, and those tips came from customers. I was free labor with no bargaining power, and that would be true anywhere in the city, as everyone in the industry knows. But we'll come back to that angle of all this. The imbalance created here is one of the biggest open secrets in America. Enter Initiative 77, a ballot resolution that sought to change this. Short version, Initiative 77 sought a gradual transition to a regular minimum wage for tipped workers. The longer version is that 77 would raise the legal minimum wage for these jobs to $15 by 2025, up from the aforementioned $3.33. The transition was to be gradual and set to match the increase to the overall DC minimum rather than an all-at-once change. Bear in mind that while $15 an hour is rather high compared to the federal minimum of $7.25, the cost of living in DC and the tax rate are to scale, or worse. Suffice to say, 77 was a fairly tepid suggestion of change. It amounted to an unreasonably long transition time for people to start paying what they should have been paying for literal decades. This is where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean paradoxically predictable and surprising. In the United States, politics is a struggle between those in power and those who vote, where those in power try to get those who vote to do so against their own interests. Much the same story here. As such, Initiative 77's very straightforward campaign of get paid for your labor was suddenly met by this out-of-nowhere counter-movement that was energized and had signs designed by someone who took graphic design and not someone who worked in labor rights. It was called Save Our Tips. Save Our Tips was a counter-movement, the vote no as far as Initiative 77 was concerned. They argued that leaving the tip earning system would mean lower wages for service workers, and they made some convincing points if you didn't have an ear trained on skepticism and experience in picking up on false promises. The point of the whole movement was to convince you, the worker, that a guaranteed wage was against your interest, similar to how anti-union efforts tend to target the idea that you'll lose more in dues than you'll gain in anything else. To clarify how they pull that idea, let's look at what they have to say on the matter according to their website, which is still up. If the tip credit is removed, many restaurants and bars will be forced to increase menu prices and decrease staff size. Tipping helps fuel the high-quality guest service that has become a hallmark of the district's world-class dining scene. Unfortunately, the changes restaurants and bar operators will be forced to make if the tip credit is eliminated will lead to a more expensive and less pleasant dining experience across the city. Let's break that down a bit. Forced to increase menu prices and decrease staff size. Forced by who? The market? It might kill you to know that the cost of your average bottle of real whiskey is $13 wholesale and you can sell around 20 shots from that bottle. Trust me when I say these places could afford to pay their workers generally, and those that couldn't were going to give up or drown in a year with the rest of the 70% of restaurants in DC that die the ignominious death of having been the 34th place to think they've invented Asian fusion tapas. If the pandemic discourse didn't make you familiar with why this is a lie, well, here it is. Tipping helps fuel the high-quality guest service that has become a hallmark of the district's world-class dining scene. Tipping fuels would be more correct here. What other fuel are they supposing runs the service industry if not the fact that it's a job where people get paid to do it? Not to undercut service industry workers, but it's not particularly essential, despite what they said early in the pandemic. There's no call of higher duty to give mimosas to college students at 10 a.m. The latter appeal of talking about the district's dining scene is a fun tip-off to their game here. Nobody in the district is proud of some stupid global image of being wage-cucked. That's something a business owner would see because it indicates market potential. This is a weak attempt to pretend this is some homegrown movement and that it's all about repping the city. The changes restaurants and bar operators will be forced to make if the tip credit is eliminated will lead to a more expensive and less pleasant dining experience across the city. Again, they use the word forced. Tip credit sounds like a neutral term. Legally, it's the wording for the system in place. It's the solution of paying people up to minimum wage if they make less than in the day. In practice, it's never really explained the right way. The right way to explain it and why it's called a credit is because from the employer position, legally, min wage is supposed to still be guaranteed, but tips can make up the wage payment as a credit. In the employer framing, it's credit against the need to pay a wage, but when they frame the whole thing to employees, they'll say they cover for an underperforming day. Do you follow the trick here? They're framing it as though your wages are supposed to be tips, but they cover bad days when you fail. Not that your wages are your wages and tips save the business money. We'll get to what I call overperformance in a moment. This excuse is, quite plainly, saying, if you force us to pay people all the time and not just when customers pay them, the business owners will have tighter margins. What's implied here by Save Our Tips is that tipping would vanish in the city overnight and it would mean businesses had to pay their workers and that workers only got minimum wage instead of the higher value of an unsourced estimate of $20 to $40 an hour. $20 to $40 an hour happens sometimes. Hell, I've made $130 an hour once, and it nearly killed me because it meant working a party of 50 basically alone. The thing is, stress is proportional to pay on one level, but also a constant. Quiet days don't always mean a quiet shift. But what they're not telling you here, for obvious reasons, is the infrequency, or rather, the frequency with which this happens. Some places in the city, no doubt, workers can pull $40 an hour daily. Most places, however, would be lucky to hit that kind of stride for even a single day. The truth is more like this. I've had days where I've made lots of money, and those days are fairly routine. In fact, they literally follow a routine, and it's called the weekend. Most people who say work for the weekend work a normal week, but live to let loose in their time off. In service, working for the weekend is something else. We work Tuesdays and make $17 total in a 10-hour shift so that we get to work the weekend where we make real money. Now, I don't like doing math because it scares me on a good day, but this was a dark arithmetic I never wanted to touch. Did making $300 in my one weekend shift feel good when it happened? Yeah. I wanted to die of exhaustion, social burnout, and a potential staph infection every time, but yeah. But I also knew, and I think everyone knew, that if you did your math on your time, added Monday's numbers to Tuesday's numbers to Wednesdays to Thursdays to Sunday's brunch, and then divided the number of hours, you'd end up making 2.5 days plus metro fare for the shifts. 20 to 40 an hour isn't an average, it's an ideal. It's your best day of a given week, and that's it. Suffice to say, proper enforcement of the tip credit system itself would technically solve this particular problem. The issue there is that it aggressively shifts the goalpost. It goes from, not only are these laws ineffective and exploitative when they work, they do not work as they are, to, we can make those inadequate laws work, maybe, without providing an actionable goal. It is worth noting that no one report comes out in this time and shatters the popular perception that this was all just okay. There is evidence that takes a more formal approach than my anecdotal one, but there will always be difficulty getting an accurate picture of how rampant things like wage theft are, especially when it disproportionately impacts marginalized people. We know these problems exist as an industry because we live them. Save Our Tips was lying to everyone on multiple levels. Of course, they had an agenda they kept purposefully vague, but they went above and beyond. They tied themselves to partisan progressive images beyond the industry, tweeting things with the Dump Trump hashtag and feigning popular mobilization rather than being paid by a collective of business owners. According to The Intercept, in June of 2018, they were run by a GOP-loyal campaign strategy company that has a record of committing its own crimes against American democracy when it can. I won't spoil it. There will be a link for when you get tired of being mad about this video. As a relevant aside, their average engagement as a Twitter account for an allegedly huge movement was incredibly small. The Dump Trump tweet itself has 4 likes and a handful of comments, mostly saying stuff to the effect of, "We see through you, shut up." All that said, they weren't actually arguing for a change in anything. There was no plan, no presentation, no strategies passed around on how to make the law, the status quo, functional. It was a campaign of emotion that kept things vague while astroturfing in order to let worker imaginations fill in the blanks of what it proposed. Look, okay, John Oliver talked about them for 5 seconds in part of a broader example. It's real, please care. Astroturfing is basically faking a grassroots movement in the way that astroturf isn't real grass. And this is what leads us forward, really. A fake grassroots campaign that allowed DC business owners to play the part of progressive #resistance members while standing atop the collective throats of their employees and calling it a moral high ground. I've no doubt some businesses earnestly believed it, and they were sold on the good for everyone narrative. In my experience, restaurants frequently have what I can only describe as a hostile culture of teamwork and friendship. They use these words and even put in place anti-worker tip pool systems that they will tell you, show we are a team, and in those instances, I think bosses believe it. They really think the earnings and all that are mutually beneficial. The culture and things like pooling are only implicitly hostile, like the way pools make it impossible to know why you're getting paid less than your coworker because you can't compare any numbers you earn even if you manage to find the time, space, and comfort with someone among the revolving door of employees to talk about wages. Save Our Tips took it to the next level. They played 5D chess with this friendship thing. And they still lost. Let's tie up some threads. Some conservative political marketing group cooked up a beautiful scam that failed to actually win them enough votes on 77 in the end. A collection of local business owners, business-oriented politicians, celebrity chefs, a faked movement, and substantial financing from the National Restaurant Association ultimately failed to win over a majority of voters. All the explaining I've done about why this is an issue, the sides in it, the stakes, they're moot. The vote happened, and the business coalition lost by a 10% margin. Story over, yay Labor, power to the bussers, right? wrong. There may be a D and a C in democracy, but there's no democracy in DC. The expressed will of the people has many deterrents, detractors, blockades, and hurdles to becoming law. The mayor decided this was the issue, Initiative 77, one where there was no partisan justification to block it, that we needed to be reminded that initiatives are more like a change.org petition to make $do the official name of the Australian currency than they are a legitimate democratic process. The council and the mayor said, actually, no, and it was just over. It couldn't happen like this anywhere else. The law was set to go into motion, but this is the district. DC has a special 30-day period where Congress reviews laws for budgetary reasons and then tells the district if they can put them into place. Here's the timeline of events so far. I'll make sure to emphasize the parts that are immediately relevant. 2012 and 2013, partial budget autonomy supposedly obtained for the district. June 21st, 2016, DC votes to put the regular minimum wage to $15 by 2020, and the tipped wage is set to go up to $5. June 19th, 2018, the initiative passes in the primary vote with 55% of the vote, a 10% margin. That same day, June 19th, 2018, the 30-day congressional review period begins. July 10th, 2018, the process to repeal begins under DC Mayor Muriel Bowser and her council. July 11th, 2018, irrespective to the repeal plan by Bowser, Congressman Mark Meadows, Republican of North Carolina, and of certain notoriety, and Gary Palmer, Republican of Alabama, members both of the Republican Freedom Caucus, bring forward an amendment to the nationwide 2019 spending bill which specifically calls to kill Initiative 77. October 16, 2018, DC Council quietly repeals 77, and 77 is replaced with the Tipped Wage Workers' Fairness Amendment Act, and subminimum wage resets to $3.89. December 13, 2018, the repeal is enacted and 77 is dead. The people of the district are already used to extra legislative, extrajudicial disregard of their rights, so most people just kind of moved on. Of course it happened. That's what happens here. It's a marvel Another Bullshit Night in Suck City wasn't a book about living in the district, but then again it would have had to be Another Bullshit Night in Suck District, and that sounds phonetically less punchy. Here's the separate effort taken by the Freedom Caucus boys. Behold the law, look upon these 6 lines and despair. Earlier I went over how one of the rules of DC is that only primaries matter. There's a good reason for that. The mayor, the council, and anyone who has ever run for them and had a chance at winning has been a Democrat. So people more or less celebrate their victory then and there when the primary results are turned out. The city votes so blue that it's got a 60% margin on average in every presidential election, even the one where Reagan won every state but Minnesota. Now, the DC mayor and council, a group of Democrats, murder the initiative. And at the same time, Republican representatives from somewhere that isn't DC and somewhere else that isn't DC tried to axe it in an ever so eloquent 6 lines. Is this the fabled bipartisanship Democrats are always talking about? Seeing as the city is forever Dem-held, and Dem-populated, the mayor, a pro-business black woman who has tirelessly worked for the betterment of her city in the eyes of white bankers, the replacement bill would be all signal, no substance. The Tipped Wage Workers' Fairness Amendment Act, as they name it, essentially does 4 things. It creates an internet website where the rights of workers can be displayed, creates a staff violation NARC hotline, provides a budget for one-time courses and a list of providers for sexual harassment training, which we'll get to, and authorizes the creation of a system by which third parties are now forcibly involved in payroll and tips. First up, the hotline. This is a well-meaning practical idea, but true to Democrat form, it fails to tackle systemic issues and as such doesn't solve the problem unless the world is already fair and functional. While I do believe they think it's a good effort, I just can't see and indeed never heard of people using it. Next, the sexual harassment issue. It's finally time to talk about sexual harassment, which has been looming in the background this whole video. Harassment, sexual or otherwise, is a product of disempowerment from 2 fronts. On one, it is tolerated because of wage insecurity and poverty and all that, general vulnerability. And on the other, those same vulnerabilities mean seeking justice, a process that requires resources which people working sub-minimum wage don't have. Even though the Democrat plan had no proposal for how to tackle that issue, systemic as it is, they did still mention the harassment for a reason. The fact that harassment is invoked in what is ostensibly otherwise a wage issue is almost impressive in a Democrat framework. It demonstrates an awareness of the interlinked broader issues of wage insecurity and the toxic environments of service. This stuff belongs right next to, and is often interlinked with, the friendship stuff from management, but I cannot do the topic justice without another hour of your time. Suffice to say, in a tipping-based system, sometimes people go along with the harassment and even the assault they're experiencing because the person doing it is the one paying them. Standing up in a big way can get you fired. Standing up in even the littlest way leaves you unpaid. The assaulter, the harasser, can decide that you don't deserve to be paid for the work you've done for them. And the Democrats couldn't just ignore it. So what did they do? They twisted it. They said, "We hear you, we see you, we understand you're upset about the harassment," blitzing past the carefully explained reasons why harassment is endemic, so they could offer up what exactly? A one-time course? The solution is nearly insulting given they've acknowledged a greater understanding of the problem. A sensitivity course does nothing to address this when compared to wage autonomy. Also, by the look of the law, I don't think it applies unless you work for the business. It's not like you can take the patrons to harassment school. In my experience, harassment and the like comes from above, from the owners and part owners, and friends of the owners, and those aren't the people who would be subject to a class. The issue is both how this fails to address the core problem of lacking any wage assurance and how it fails to disempower assaulters. Ultimately, this new law used said genuine issue to try and legitimate an entirely regressive bill compared to what people had asked for. Okay, on to the final point. From what I understand, this payroll fix has been slightly helpful for a few people, but we're dealing with layers of disenfranchisement here that go beyond voting. Third-party payroll sounds like something that should be almost default, right? Well, there's some reasons that this wasn't the case before, and they'll bleed into why it ultimately isn't very helpful. The issue is that second-class workers, be they immigrants or people lacking degrees, are disproportionately prevalent in service work? Wonder why that is and who might benefit and why they would choose these workers in particular. It's not that having no high school degree or citizenship relegates one to service work, it's that those people are less likely to know their rights or how to use them, and businesses know that. That's why people get paid under the table, in cash, aren't on payroll in the first place. The law presumes other laws are functioning. I suppose that would be the case for a $15 min wage too, but it's far easier to spread the word that someone is getting ripped off when there's not a fluctuating mystery baseline. And that's where the Democrat solution left off, making the impression of a safety net and a critical response to systemic issues with no commitment to either building a net or tearing down any structures. It could not have gone worse or more against the whims of the people as to end up where we are, and it took a long time for me to explain how we got here. So, okay, did I really talk about the lack of representation in the district and the oversight Congress can freely deploy whenever, just to mention 2 out-of-touch Republican representatives who tried to meddle and didn't even need to because the city council betrayed its people? Yes, but also no. I wanted to set a scene, as I said. I wanted to set a record, and that scene is the district, and the record is one of disenfranchisement. Tipping started as a way to avoid paying blacks for their labor in the Reconstruction era, and it more or less hasn't stopped being that. The only progressive thing about changes in labor practices in the tipping industry is that the scope of who worked there has expanded as poverty has become the largest transracial unifier in America. The whole underclass of the city, which doubtless is disproportionately minority and marginalized groups, is getting ripped off together. And unity in the face of a campaign of lies didn't stop it or count for anything. There is no doubt in my mind that DC statehood is held back in no small part due to 2 of the most distinct things I've mentioned about the district. It's always been more left-leaning and blacker than certain segments of America would like. But that leads us to the feigned representation of those realities. It doesn't matter if the mayor is a black Democrat and the Democrat council represents several races with its members, because no matter who it was, Democrat, Republican, whoever, they still tried and succeeded in destroying this chance for an egregious injustice to simply begin to be undone. I've spent too many words on all this to just end with, it sucks, I know, but really, it sucks, I know. What else can we do in a city that wasn't supposed to be a city? Take comfort in indignation? Maybe. Get madder? I don't know. March to the mayor and get ignored again? Well, kinda, actually. A year ago, the conclusion to this video was a fair bit different. And in fact, there's a glimmer of hope again. As recently as the 2022 November vote, a revived form of 77, this time called Initiative 82, was on the ballot and went through. Seeing how it went last time, you'll have to forgive my lack of optimism. Still, it's something, and I kinda suspect even DC politicians can't pull the same stunt twice. Right? I guess we'll see. Despite that, I'd like to dip into some revolutionary hope here. I guess all I can really say is, if you're from DC and you've stuck around this long, don't die. Don't let the powers in that place kill you. Don't be like democracy in DC, which dies and dies again. To those from outside the city, with more power than any of those who feed and clothe the most powerful men and women of the free world, I ask that you simply know stories like these, and that when I say the district instead of DC or Washington, I'm making a statement about the unique conditions of the city. Not good ones, unique ones, district things. I guess to you all, I also say, don't die. Get mad, but don't die. In such a city, with such tipped scales of injustice and inequality, there's no hill worth dying on. Okay, yay, it's done. This was supposed to be a really easy and fun way to reflect on the progress I've made while also updating a video, which I think had an important message, but was marred by its amateurism. And then I got sick while recording, and it just really dragged on and kind of stole a chunk of my soul. Oh well, I'm still glad to have made it. When I first made this video, I didn't have supporters in any form, really. No subscribers, no viewers, no patrons, none of that. And I'd like to thank everyone here for the fact that that's no longer true. Special thanks goes to Chandler Mason, Etienne Garant, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Hausum, Nick, and Nitessergon. And that's it for now. Next time will be the Sovietology video, and then after that it's a bit looser, but I've tweeted and community posted about vague goings-on in the next year, so find that info there if you care to. Bye.